Good morning, everybody. It's Joanna here. I am an IBS, FODMAP and food intolerance specialist dietitian at Everyday Nutrition. This morning, we're going to be talking all about lactose intolerance. We're going to talk about what lactose is, where it's found, how to know if you're intolerant to it, and how to manage it as well, if that's you. Quick mention to our sponsor, who is K-Fiber. Where can I pop that? K-Fiber sponsoring this little Facebook Live so that I can come here and talk to you. So without much further ado, lactose. Lactose, let's start with the sciencey stuff and get that out of the way. Lactose is a disaccharide. It falls under the D of the FODMAP acronym. Di meaning two, and what that means is that lactose is two sugar molecules. So there is a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule, and these two molecules are bound fairly tightly together and actually need an enzyme to separate them. So when we consume lactose containing foods, obviously in through the mouth, down into the stomach, into the small intestine, and in the lining of the small intestine, it looks a little bit like a shag pile carpet. It's got all these little sort of floaty villi that are lining the small intestine, and those villi are really cool because they increase the surface area, so they help with the absorption of food in that way, but they also produce enzymes which help break down the food as well. And one of the enzymes they produce is an enzyme called lactase. And what lactase does is when the lactose comes along, the lactase comes out and it actually breaks that bond and separates the two molecules. So we end up, instead of having a disaccharide of glucose and galactose joined together, we end up with two single monosaccharides or single sugar molecules, a glucose molecule and a galactose molecule, both of which are easily absorbed into the body for use however the body sees fit at the time. If, however, and this happens in some people have very low levels of the lactase enzyme, and there's actually a gene variant that is really common in some ethnic communities where they don't have any lactose at all. So what happens if you have low levels of lactose or don't have any lactase at all, then you're unable to break that lactose molecule in half. So it stays as two sugars bound together very tightly, and then it becomes too big to absorb into the body. So it then stays in the small intestine, it continues its path down into the large intestine and leaves the body when you have a bowel movement. Now, that's not a dangerous process, but as the lactase passes through the large intestine, it does do two things which can cause stomach upset in some people. So one of the things lactase does is it draws a lot of water into the large intestine, and when you fill that large intestine with water, you'll end up with loose, watery bowel movements because that water has got to come out somehow. The other thing that happens is that when the lactose is in there, it is fermented by the bacteria that live in your large intestine. So we all have about 1 to 2 kilos of bacteria that live there. That's called your gut microbiome. It's really good for you, but those bacteria need fuel to stay alive, and there's nothing more that they love. They will feed on the lactose as that's passing through it all as well. When they feed on the lactose, that does create gas as a side effect, and that will contribute to making people feel bloated. So lactose intolerance is when you've got low levels of lactase and you're unable to break down all the lactose. It travels through to the large intestine where it's fermented, and it attracts water, which causes gas, it causes bloating, it causes loose, watery bowel movements, which we all know are classic of lactose intolerance. So that's what lactose is, that's what lactase is, and that's what lactose intolerance is. So lactose is obviously found in a lot of milk and milk products. So lactose is the natural sugar molecule that's found in milk. So we see it in milk, we see it in yogurt, we see it in custards, and we see it in ice creams. There are some milk products that during the processing of making them, the lactose is actually removed. So things like cheese and butter that do not contain any sugar or carbohydrate molecules are naturally lactose free, whereas milks and yogurts that do contain some of that natural milk sugar contain lactose. And one of the ways that you can know whether the product that you're holding contains lactose or not is that obviously when you start by having a look at the ingredients list will list what is actually in that product, and if there are no added sweeteners and no added fruits added to it, then you know that the carbohydrate or sugar content listed on the nutrition information panel is actually reflective of the lactose that's in the product. So that'll be things like plain milk that doesn't have anything added to it. If we've got plain Greek or plain yogurts that don't have any added fruits or sweeteners to them, and also cheese that doesn't have any sweeteners, fruits added to it, and butter, no sweetness, no fruits added. So the carbohydrate content will be directly reflective of the lactose content. So that tells us obviously that cheese and butter do not contain any carbohydrates, so they don't contain any lactose, whereas milk, yogurt, ice cream and custards do contain some of that natural milk sugar, so they do contain some of that lactose. Now when it comes to lactose intolerance, it's really not a black or white thing. So it tends to be more of a continuum where most people will produce some degree of lactase, but they will get to a limit where they are no longer, where they sort of only have a certain amount of lactase, and once that lactase is used up, they don't have any left over. So if you're consuming lactose containing products above your amount of lactase that you produce, then that leftover is what's going to not be absorbed and is going to potentially be an issue for you. So I often like to say to not think of this as, yes, I'm lactose intolerant and no, I'm not lactose intolerant, because it's not that you can't have any milk at all. It's just about keeping your milk intake below your threshold for the lactase. We do find that there is some variation depending on whether you consume the lactose in terms of food or in a liquid. So liquids are often delivered a lot faster than solids. Also, if you consume your milk with a meal, that's going to slow down the lactose as well. So it's going to make it slightly better tolerated. Intestinal transit time also has an effect on lactose as well. So if you have a fairly slow intestinal transit, then you're going to find that you can manage that lactose that little bit better as it passes through. When we're making lactose free products, one of the things that, or how we do that is, if we get a bottle of milk and we want to make it lactose free, we can actually add the enzyme lactase artificially to that milk, and that enzyme is going to go through and it's going to break down the lactose and make that milk lactose free before you actually drink it. The other thing that you can do is you can actually buy lactase tablets. Sometimes they're called Lactese, lacto-free, Lactaid, at the chemist, and if you take one of those tablets with your milk or milk product, that's also going to break down that lactose and make it easier to absorb as well. So what do we know about how much lactose people tend to tolerate? So there is a fair bit of research out there. We've known about lactose intolerance since about the late 1950s, early 1960s. So we've got a good 50, 60, 70 years, or 50, 60 years worth of research there on lactose intolerance. So we actually have a really good understanding of what it is, what the levels are, how much people tolerate, how much people don't tolerate, and what's going on there. And what that research tells us is that most people who are lactose sensitive, who have some degree of lactose intolerance, will tolerate about 4 to 7 grams of lactose in a sitting, or up to 15 grams of lactose spread out across the day. And they'll tolerate that fairly well before it starts causing problems. 4 to 7 grams of lactose is equivalent to around about a quarter to a half a cup of milk. That 15 grams of lactose would be a full cup of milk. So as you can see, a little bit is usually really well tolerated, whereas larger amounts start to become an issue. So it's really that continuum that I was talking about, where it's not just a black and white thing. If you're having a cup of tea, you can usually easily add a little splash of regular milk to that and be okay. Whereas if you're looking at a full milkshake or something, that's when it's going to start to become that problem, because that's when you start not having enough of that lactase enzyme to break down all the lactose. FODMAPs, where do FODMAPs come into this? So like I said, lactose is a disaccharide, which is the D of the FODMAP acronym. So lactose intolerance is covered within a low FODMAP diet. So if you're on a low FODMAP diet and you have lactose intolerance, you do not need to restrict your lactose containing foods any further than FODMAP. In fact, the FODMAP cutoff for lactose is a really super conservative 1 gram of lactose per serve. So if we know that most people tolerate that 4 to 7 grams a serve, the FODMAP cutoffs are actually stricter than what we would normally do for someone who is just lactose intolerant on its own. So you know for sure that if it's low FODMAP, then you know for sure that it's also going to be considered lactose free or low enough in lactose to be well tolerated. So how do we test for lactose intolerance? And this is a really interesting one because we can do blood tests. We can also take biopsies from the lining of the small bowel and look at the lactase molecule to see how much lactase you produce there. And we can also do breath tests that give us an indication of how much of the lactose you're malabsorbing. The thing is with these blood tests, breath tests and biopsies is they tell us, yes, you've got some degree of lactose intolerance because when you look at them, there's a cutoff. And if you're above the cutoff, they say there's lactose intolerance. If you're below the cutoff, they say there's not lactose intolerance. So they kind of make it really black and white, either you are or you aren't. And like I've already said, it's really not a black and white thing. It tends to be a continuum. The other thing is that we know that there are people who don't have a lot of lactase, but so essentially they would malabsorb lactose, but when they consume lactose-containing problems, they don't get any of those symptoms that are related to it. So they don't get any gas or bloating or loose watery bowel movements. And because that malabsorption in itself is not dangerous to the body, if you're not getting symptoms from it, there's really no reason to limit the food. If, however, you are getting symptoms, then you will want to limit that food to the degree that you need to so that you don't get symptoms. So it's that symptom production that's really our benchmark of whether you need to limit that food or not. So even if you've had a breath test or a biopsy that's told you that, yes, you are lactose intolerant, that doesn't guarantee that it's the lactose that's necessarily triggering IBS symptoms or not. And it also doesn't tell us where your threshold is for how much lactose you tolerate and how much and where you want to limit it to maintain that digestive comfort. Realistically, the only way that you can actually do that is through a food challenge where you limit your lactose containing foods for a couple of weeks until things settle, and if you're feeling well, you then reintroduce the lactose very slowly over a few days. So normally we would start out with around about 1/4 of a cup of milk on that first day. A day or two later, if you were okay with that, you would increase that amount to around about 1/2 cup of milk to see how you go with that. If you're okay with that, a couple of days later, you will go up to a full cup of milk to see how you tolerate that. And what that's going to tell you is that's going to tell you, first of all, does lactose trigger symptoms in you or not? Because if you can drink a full milkshake and not get any symptoms, then you definitely know that you are not that you don't need to limit the lactose. If you do get symptoms to one of those amounts, that's going to tell you where your threshold is. So that's what's essentially going to tell you, do you tolerate 1/4 of a cup? Do you tolerate 1/2 cup before it starts becoming an issue? And you can then use that information in the future to know how careful you need to be with lactose containing products before they start causing an issue. So what have we covered? We've talked about what lactose intolerance is. We've talked about what it's affected by. We've talked about what foods contain lactose and what don't. We've talked about lactase enzymes that you can add or take in tablet form. We've talked about what the research says in terms of how much lactose people tend to tolerate. We've talked about what the FODMAP cutoff is for lactose. We've talked about how to test for lactose and how to identify your thresholds. The last thing to talk about is if it does turn out that you are lactose intolerant, how you're going to manage that in the long term. And look, there's really no one right or wrong answer to this. It's going to be different things for different people based on your situation. So one of the things that we always try to do is we really want to make your diet fit to your lifestyle rather than having to change your lifestyle to fit with your diet. So that's that's all about that quality of life, which is super, super important. Obviously, how much digestive discomfort you're getting has an impact on quality of life, but also how much you need to change your life to manage that digestive discomfort has an impact on quality of life as well. So working out where that balance is for you is super, super important. And obviously identifying your threshold helps a lot with that. What I would normally recommend to people is when you're home, in that home situation, I'd recommend buying lactose-free milk, lactose-free yogurts, lactose-free ice creams, lactose-free custards, so all of those dairy products. There's no need to buy lactose-free cheese. You can buy it, but it's really just a bit of a gimmick. There's no difference between cheese labelled lactose-free and cheese that isn't labelled lactose-free. When it comes to cheese, anything that you can cut or grate is going to be low in lactose. Anything that you can stick your finger in and swish it around is going to have some degree of lactose in it. So if you're comparing something like a ricotta cheese, which has some lactose, to something like a tasty cheese that doesn't have lactose. So when you're buying your cheeses, think, can I slice this or grate this? If I can, I don't need to worry about lactose. If I can stick my finger in it and swish it around, then I perhaps want to either limit my serve size of it, or I want to take a lactase tablet with it, depending on what your threshold is. So I would be buying lactose-free products at home. When it comes to going out and traveling around, look, a lot of cafes these days do stock lactose-free milk. So if you're wanting to get a latte or hot chocolate or something, you can often get that made with lactose-free milk. You can also use milk alternatives, so plant milks, things like soy milk, almond milks, oat milks. They don't have lactose in them. Depending on what your other sensitivities are, you may want one of those, or another of those may or may not be suitable for you. So you've got your lactose-free milks, you've got your plant milks that are fairly common these days. The other thing that you can do is grab some of those lactase tablets from the chemist, carry them in your handbag. If you're out and about and you're really dying to have an ice cream and they don't have a lactose-free option, then you get your regular ice cream, you grab your lactase tablets and you just chew on one of those at the same time that you're having your ice cream, so that the ice cream and the lactase are in your stomach at the same time, and then that tablet is going to break down the lactose for you, so that that's going to be super well tolerated. I think that's everything that I wanted to cover this morning. So I really want to, special thanks to K-Fibre, who have sponsored this and allowed me to bring the information to you. And I will run through the comments now. I'll answer any questions in the comments. I hope that you all have a really lovely day. It's beautifully bright and sunny here in Melbourne. We're in lockdown, so I'm going to go and enjoy some of that sun. Have a great day, and I will see you all soon. Bye.